click on the interpretation globe, and you can choose English or Spanish, or don't click at all and you'll hear in the original language.
John, will
Yes.
you be recording? Will you be recording this event?
Yes, this session will be recorded. So everybody who's joining now, that's another point, realize that the session will be recorded. We'll give people a few more minutes or a couple more minutes to join, and then we'll get underway. All right. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is John Walsh, and I'm the Senior Associate at the Washington Office on Latin America. Sorry, Senior Associate, my former title. I'm the Director for Drug Policy in the Andes. It's a real pleasure to welcome you today to our event, Bolivia at the Ballot Box. Will elections provide a path to peace or plunge the country into renewed crisis? We're just days away from Bolivia's elections on October 18th, obviously, and we thought we'd take a moment to step back and reflect on the roots of Bolivia's current political crisis, the current electoral campaign, and some scenarios for the future, depending on the outcome of the voting on October 18th. We have really an embarrassment of riches today to help us address these topics, and I'll introduce them in short order. First, to make sure everybody understands, we have simultaneous interpretation. Please go look at the lower right of your screen, and you'll see the interpretation globe, and you can click on English or Spanish if you choose. We will be recording this session today as well, and we'll be able to post it as soon as possible. So just a couple of contextual comments. Everybody, not everybody, but most people would agree that free and fair periodic elections are an essential ingredient of democracy. They're not the only, but they're essential. Indeed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 21, number 3 says, "The will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting procedures." All right. Let's not forget that. At the same time, we also recognize that even in tranquil times, electoral processes can accentuate divisions and propel polarization and conflict. even in tranquil times. And we know that's not what we're living in Bolivia today, anything but. It's fiercely polarized. So we're aware that, and this speaks to the title of our event today under discussion, this electoral process could be a path to peace for Bolivia, peaceful coexistence in the future. But it could, again, plunge the country back into crisis. And those are the issues we wanted to discuss. Today we'll lead with Eduardo Rodriguez Belce, former president of Bolivia, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He ushered Bolivia to elections at a time of similar fraught politics. And I think he has a unique position and perspective to offer us today as Bolivia is again on the cusp of elections. Rodrigo will be followed by Catherine Lederber, the director of the Andean Information Network based in Cochabamba, Bolivia, longtime Bolivia analyst on the ground in Bolivia and has been very close at hand to not just recent developments, but developments over the years, indeed the decades, and has really, really refined analysis to offer as well about the past and potential ways forward. And then finally, we'll be joined by Santiago Andrea, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Latin American Studies at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania. His research has focused on social movements, political parties, and democracy. And his 2018 book, in fact, was called When Movements Become Parties, The Bolivian MAS in Comparative Perspective. We'll go sequentially. Eduardo, Catherine, Santiago. Eduardo will make his remarks in Spanish. Then we'll have a conversation among panelists raising issues and open for Q&A. So without further ado, I will hand off to Eduardo Rodriguez. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and we look forward to a very insightful discussion. Eduardo?
Thank you, Jonah, and thank you, everyone. I will be speaking in Spanish, but later on, if I might follow some English questions anyway. Buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias a WOLA por darnos la oportunidad de reflexionar sobre Bolivia y la próxima elección. Es un acontecimiento, como anotaba John, que marcará un antes y un después en el futuro del país y sobre todo en un futuro que puede estar marcado por mayor paz y confraternidad o mayor confrontación. Yo no quiero dar una disertación muy elaborada, más bien hacer reflexiones que son importantes para analizar lo que está ocurriendo y lo que va a pasar en Bolivia. Es importante dar un contexto no de los 14 años inmediatamente transcurridos en el gobierno del MAS, ni de los 21 días que tomó a la resistencia al derrocamiento del gobierno de Evo Morales. Yo prefiero significar en esta oportunidad que hay que destacar que Bolivia vive casi 40 años del tiempo democrático más importante de su historia. Son 38 años de democracia ininterrumpida, democracia entendida con elecciones sucesivas y gobiernos civiles. Pero también hay que significar que no han sido tiempos sencillos ni ha sido un tránsito suave. Varios presidentes en este tiempo democrático renunciaron. Lo hizo Siles Suazo para acortar su mandato, lo hizo Sánchez de Lozada y lo hizo Mesa para enfrentar o más bien superar un problema de gobernabilidad, lo hizo Banzer por un problema de salud y finalmente lo hizo Evo Morales. Tuvimos dos gobiernos de transición, uno que me tocó presidir el año 2005 a 2006 en casi 8 meses de gobierno, y estamos viviendo un segundo gobierno de transición con Yanine Áñez. De manera que es importante destacar que Bolivia debe mantener un proceso democrático pese a estas dificultades propias de un país en el que hay algunas consideraciones que hacer y creo que son oportunas, es oportuno hacerlo ahora. Es interesante destacar que, por ejemplo, son más de 10 o 12 personajes políticos que son los permanentes candidatos a la presidencia y que hoy mismo intentan llegar al poder. Y esto refleja una característica muy importante que es el presidencialismo en Bolivia, al igual que en el resto de la región. Una característica que además trae o refleja también la falta de un sistema de partidos políticos sólidos, estables y permanentes. Interesante destacar, como digo, que de los candidatos que tenemos hoy, Carlos Mesa ya fue presidente, intenta volver. Tuto Quiroga, bueno, que se bajó hace días atrás, intentaba volver. Yanine Áñez, siendo presidente, quería volver a ser presidente. Y también hay que decirlo, Evo Morales estuvo 3 periodos, intentaba un 4º periodo. Hay una característica que nos acompaña en Bolivia, que es un marcado presidencialismo y que a mi juicio ha impedido la conformación de partidos sólidos y liderazgos alternativos que puedan contribuir a refrescar, si vale el término, un sistema político mucho más sólido. Pero esta es una de las características que voy a intentar marcar como uno de los temas que hay que reflexionar en Bolivia. Y otra es la falta de sistema de contrapesos y balances, o controles y contrapesos, lo que ustedes llaman los checks and balances, que no han sido precisamente los más efectivos en el último tiempo. Esto como un marco preliminar. Tampoco quiero caer en este debate que a mi juicio es muy reduccionista de que si hubo o no hubo golpe el año pasado. Yo prefiero creer que hubo algo mucho más complejo y algo mucho más serio. Y eso es lo que a mi juicio fue un descarrilamiento, un derailment en inglés, del proceso democrático, del orden constitucional y de un sistema de garantías. Y este descarrilamiento empieza incluso en la última etapa del gobierno de Evo, cuando empiezan a surgir señales que eran muy serias y avisoraban o podían marcar un tiempo de crisis. Y me refiero concretamente al propósito que tuvo el gobierno de Evo de intentar una reelección adicional al mandato del presidente y el vicepresidente. Pese a que el 2006 hubo un referéndum por el cual la población determinó de que no había lugar a modificar la Constitución, el gobierno acudió al Tribunal Constitucional, a una modalidad de revisión judicial de la Constitución, sobre la cual voy a comentar algo más adelante, y que encontró un razonamiento, por cierto, muy debatible y poco sostenido de que era un derecho humano volver a ser candidato. Esta fue un primer síntoma de este descarrilamiento democrático, porque abrió un proceso electoral muy extraño a mi juicio, porque yo, pese a que me encontraba fuera de Bolivia, noté de que iba marcando un aire enrarecido en las elecciones, porque si bien había un candidato o varios candidatos que participaban, entre ellos el propio Carlos Mesa, Óscar Ortiz y otros personajes, Quiroga, tampoco había una manifestación explícita de reordenar la democracia. Pero aún así, llegamos a las elecciones y la duda sobre la legitimidad de este proceso electoral se vio enrarecida por la interrupción de un conteo rápido y las acusaciones de un fraude que están todavía flotando en el aire. Yo recuerdo que la última instrucción diplomática que recibí en Holanda fue lograr los apoyos de estos países europeos, de los cuales yo estaba acreditado, Holanda y Portugal, para que contribuyan y endosen la moción de una auditoría por la OEA. Y así lo hicieron. Holanda fue uno de los principales contribuyentes a este proceso, en el entendido de que eran medios pacíficos los que debían contribuir a solucionar una crisis que se tornaba violenta. Y este es el tema más penoso. Las instituciones democráticas no fueron capaces de encontrar formas pacíficas de resolver esa crisis política, electoral, social, y la gente salió a las calles y se confrontó. Obviamente no se puede decir, por lo menos por lo que se conoce gradualmente, que solamente una de las fracciones era responsable de todo el caos. Se quemaron recintos electorales en 5 departamentos. Y finalmente, para hacer corta la historia que ustedes conocen, las fuerzas del orden, la policía, las fuerzas armadas decidieron tomar partido y provocaron la renuncia del presidente Evo Morales. Si uno hace un recuento grande de lo que pasó, puede tal vez concluir que fue un descarrilamiento total, un fracaso explícito de un poder electoral, un órgano electoral que no tuvo la legitimidad, la capacidad de conducir unas elecciones de manera transparente, confiable para una población que, pese a las dificultades y a la sombra de la reelección, concurrió pacíficamente. No tuvimos un órgano legislativo que, en coordinación con el resto de los poderes, estuvo organizado, presente para organizar una sucesión legítima ante la renuncia del presidente Morales. Y tampoco el Poder Ejecutivo, a mi juicio, obró con la suficiente, por decir, madurez de reconducir el proceso electoral, y los mensajes sobre la renuncia y la posibilidad de abrir un nuevo proceso fueron muy ambiguos. Y lo más penoso es que la población salió a las calles y se confrontó. Empezó un proceso de polarización que, hay que decirlo, es muy lamentable, porque al inicio de esta conversación yo decía que teníamos casi 40 años de democracia, y lo que vivimos el año pasado fue una regresión, un proceso muy triste, porque los bolivianos estaban nuevamente confrontados. Este, a mi juicio, es el escenario que por lo menos nos tocó vivir, y que nos abrió una sucesión sobre la cual yo quiero hacer algunas consideraciones como ex presidente de otra sucesión que se produjo 15 años atrás. A mi juicio, un gobierno de transición debe ser un puente de emergencia, si vale la analogía. Un puente de emergencia cuyas bases están sentadas en la propia Constitución, y que le permite reponer o restablecer el orden democrático, la conformación de los órganos de poder público, y hacerlo con la más absoluta imparcialidad y efectividad, para que se restituya o se reencarrile, si vale el término, el orden democrático. Cuando a mí me convocaron hace 15 años a convertirme en presidente, yo era la cabeza del órgano judicial que, por la Constitución, como un órgano colectivo, debía reemplazar las sucesivas renuncias del presidente, del vicepresidente y las cabezas del legislativo. Se reunió el Congreso, y por una votación y por unanimidad y luego de consideraciones votaron una norma por la cual se convocaba al presidente de la Corte Suprema a conducir una elección, un proceso de transición, y convertirlo en presidente. Esto lamentablemente no ocurrió el año pasado, y ese fue tal vez el último empuje al descarrilamiento democrático que tuvimos, porque en lugar de tener una sesión de las cámaras de senadores y diputados y ajustar los liderazgos y las presidencias, sobrevino una autoproclamación que, a mi juicio, no respondía a la norma constitucional y al menor sentido común, porque era una segunda vicepresidenta quien, arropada por las autoridades militares, decidió convertirse en presidenta del Estado plurinacional. A esto debo agregar un elemento que a mi juicio es fundamental en la mirada histórica, pero sobre todo en la proyección de lo que nos toca hacer en Bolivia, y es el control judicial de la constitucionalidad. En Bolivia hemos estado acudiendo al Tribunal Constitucional, que es una institución muy respetable, y obviamente uno puede tener diferencias sobre la forma del diseño, concentrado o no concentrado de este tribunal, pero tuvo algunas decisiones cuestionadas en el último tiempo. Una de ellas fue la que mencioné, la de reconocer el derecho humano de una reelección, y otra trascendental fue emitir un comunicado, un simple comunicado, por el cual avalaba la autoproclamación de Yanine Áñez. Entonces, hay una suerte de desprestigio autoproducido por el Tribunal Constitucional, que de un tiempo a esta parte se ha vuelto una especie de colegislador en Bolivia, y que todos los temas que resultan políticamente difíciles mandan a este tribunal, cuya conformación, como otros, es de dudosa legitimidad. Pero avanzamos y encontramos que este gobierno de transición no solamente ingresa y se asienta, y de alguna manera, y hay que reconocer el crédito también, de lograr un acuerdo con el legislativo mayoritariamente a cargo del MAS para recomponer el órgano electoral, el Tribunal Supremo Electoral, con gente que por lo menos tiene un consenso y alguna capacidad para organizar el proceso electoral. Pero de otra manera, el sistema democrático, el orden de gobernabilidad es pura apariencia, porque los órganos de poder público en Bolivia no coordinan y no cooperan entre sí en función de los altos intereses de la población, como debería suceder. La animadversión entre el Ejecutivo y el Legislativo es prácticamente escandalosa. No hay controles y contrapesos. No se aprueban decisiones legislativas ni ejecutivas que acompañen una situación de crisis, de emergencia como es la sanitaria, y más bien esta polarización institucional aleja más las posibilidades de pensar en grandes acuerdos en beneficio de la población. También tengo que agregar que la decisión de la presidenta Áñez de convertirse en candidata fue la revelación más explícita de que el interés de un gobierno de transición no era precisamente reconducir el país a un orden democrático, sino más bien tomar una ventaja del poder para hacer lo que se le criticó tanto a Evo Morales, de convertirse en parte del poder y llevar a su propio candidato. Esta decisión afortunadamente fue revertida hace poco, pero ya se generó un daño al gobierno de transición que a mi juicio es irreparable. Hay un elemento adicional y es muy, muy importante que yo quiero significar, y tiene que ver con la violencia que se produjo en los acontecimientos del año pasado, y sobre todo la vulneración de los derechos fundamentales de las personas. El momento en el que la violencia confrontaba a los bolivianos y las fuerzas del orden tomaron las calles, se produjeron cientos de heridos y muchos muertos, sobre todo en Sencata y en Sacaba, acontecimientos que no han sido objeto de investigación seria y menos de la apertura de un proceso judicial que se extraña, ¿no? Hoy día, si uno mira los periódicos en Bolivia, la gente está más preocupada por lo que fue un fraude o las contingencias electorales, pero se han olvidado de las víctimas de la política. Y en este periodo de 40 años de democracia es una verdadera lástima que sigamos perdiendo vidas humanas y tengamos gente que no encuentra una reparación. Bueno, ese es el escenario en grande. Yo creo que había que decir algunas cosas. Y a mi juicio, toda esta serie de crisis, que son muchas crisis al mismo tiempo. El año pasado teníamos una crisis de incendios en la Amazonía boliviana que hoy se reproduce. Tuvimos una crisis política y tenemos una crisis de la pandemia que es muy difícil sobrellevar en un país que todavía tiene grandes limitaciones en sus condiciones sanitarias y de pobreza. A mi juicio, estas crisis abren un momento constituyente, es decir, la necesidad de examinar un nuevo pacto social que contribuya a los bolivianos a mejorar no solamente la formalidad de una constitución escrita, pero sobre todo un ambiente de convivencia en el que se supere lo que hoy en Bolivia es un blanco y negro. O eres del MAS o eres anti-MAS. Es una polarización enfermiza, a mi juicio. Hoy día se confunde lo que es el servicio público de 500.000 de bolivianos que son funcionarios públicos, pero si trabajaron durante los últimos 14 años, básicamente son masistas despreciables para unos, y para muchos que hacen política, el resto son los golpistas despreciables. Es un desencanto de la posibilidad de convivir en paz. De manera que hay que trabajar en el ánimo de la gente. Posiblemente los resultados serán muy ajustados. Tendremos un presidente y vicepresidente electos, es posible, en una primera o segunda vuelta, pero lo que sí es claro que tendremos una asamblea legislativa en la que sean necesarios grandes acuerdos, que haya necesidad de gobernabilidad, por lo menos en lo que respecta a un sistema de salud con las condiciones básicas para seguir enfrentando la pandemia y la pospandemia. En educación, el gobierno ha cerrado las escuelas y las universidades y es el principal rubro de nuestro presupuesto. Educar a los jóvenes, y no se hace mucho al respecto, no hay acuerdos. La economía está en una crisis muy seria, ya estamos acudiendo al crédito externo para el gasto corriente, y será necesario que los políticos y quienes conducen el país tengan la grandeza, la madurez de por lo menos ponerse de acuerdo en las características o condiciones básicas de recuperar la renta pública y la forma de sostener la economía. Y finalmente, y con esto debería concluir, renovar un sistema judicial. Sin una justicia independiente en la cual se garanticen los derechos fundamentales con debido proceso y con tribunales confiables, no podremos seguir avanzando. Para mí la justicia es tal vez el elemento fundamental de este proceso democrático, pero hay mucho todavía que hacer, y con esto creo que llegué al tiempo y dejo para ustedes las reflexiones y obviamente abierto a las preguntas que puedan tener más adelante. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you, Eduardo. I think you've provided us a wider context and an even sharper understanding, I'd say, of the stakes in the upcoming election. And I think that points to the kind of signals that political leaders are sending to their followers in the days ahead. If there is a chance to provide leadership that shows restraint and escape from conflict rather than stoking it and renewing it, I think is a big question, especially if the election is as tight as the polls suggest it might be. I think we'll turn to some of those questions now. I want to encourage people, and at Eduardo's invitation as well, to use the Q&A box to send questions as the presentations are made, and we'll address as many as we can at the conclusion of presentations. Also, if you're later joining us, take advantage of the interpretation feature, the globe in the lower right of your screen. English or Spanish is yours to choose. Our next presenters, Catherine and Santiago, will be making their presentations in English. Okay, Catherine.
Thanks very much, John. I just want to compliment Eduardo's very thorough comments with some of the ideas about, the flaws in the interim government in terms of, we can speak of a period of transition before Agnes took over that was conflictive and there was violence on both sides. The day before she took power, the Bolivian armed forces went out on the streets and there were immediately 6 Bolivians killed from use of military firearms. So, there are several agendas that are pending still beyond impunity and human rights. And I think that this is something that's very important for the international community to take into account. I think the international community committed a strategic error or misread the situation when their perception was that by sessioning Congress and calling an electoral court, all of the problems with the violent transition and with Agnes's government had been solved. And really, although the armed forces stopped shooting, it was the beginning of a very protracted phase of actions of the interim government, harassment of journalists, continued attacks against community radio stations, acute political persecution of former officials, MAS representatives, and union leaders, and a very abusive, repressive focus to the COVID-19 Supreme decrees, something that has continued, although some of these unconstitutional and abusive regulations have been repealed. There is in the current campaign, this rarefied campaign status where the election has been postponed 3 times, where there has, because of the COVID pandemic, been very little ability to hold a traditional campaign, but also at the same time, this political persecution where several MAS candidates are currently imprisoned on charges of sedition, where MAS candidates have been detained and MAS social movement leaders have been detained as recently as yesterday, and another on Monday, and continued attacks against human rights monitors have been led directly by the state, or the state has not defended them in any rule. There's prosecution against the human rights ombudsman in Cochabamba for negligence of duties. Other former officials and high-ranking officials are facing the same kinds of judicial processes. And so, we saw Assistant Secretary of State Kozak's tweet that congratulating Bolivia on these transparent, fair, and free, inclusive elections. But we really have to wonder at this point in time, 4 days away from the election, if this continued discourse and pressure actually has provided that context. And I would say that it has not. At the same time, we have a very worrisome role of the Bolivian armed forces, a role that's unconstitutional as decision makers. It was completely unconstitutional for them to ask Morales to step down. And their further actions in alliance as a partner with the Agnes government have been reprehensible and have been subject to very little condemnation on the part of the international community. I mean, there's been a denial of the massacres of Sacaba and Sincata when a supreme decree to guarantee impunity had been passed, violating all national and international norms. The Agnes administration has awarded the armed forces and praised them, and at the same time has allowed the Bolivian generals to promote themselves without the congressional approval that's stipulated in the Constitution. It is not democratic, and it really harks back to the Bolivian dictatorship, something that we had assumed had ended, that the generals would go to the floor of Bolivian Congress and pressure and threaten the head of the Senate, Eva Copa, and then the government would threaten to put her in jail also for not accepting these promotions. This is something that basically went by without international recognition. This is the stuff that dictatorships are made of, and it's something that the international community needs to be cognizant of. With the current electoral process, there has been no debate amongst the candidates about what the role of the armed forces should be. how to return the Bolivian armed forces or the Bolivian police force to their constitutional role as law enforcement for the police and external security for the Bolivian armed forces. This is something that will be decisive in the future of Bolivian democracy, and it's not even been put on the table. At the same time, the Bolivian armed forces have emphatically said that MAS will not take power again, regardless of the election results. This is something that we need to have very clear and present, because this election is not only about counting votes and a fraud that has been announced by the right, once again, far in advance of the elections. It is also about voter suppression. It's also about the ability for opposition candidates to have their voice heard. And it's about the ability to move forward and to seek out reconciliation in this process, something that's not going to happen when the security forces are operating independently and have a political opinion. It's not going to happen when those security forces and government forces are coordinating openly and rewarding parastate groups like the Santa Cruz Youth League, which Luis Fernando Camacho was previously a leader of. This is an organization that is ultra-right and uses the Nazi salute. These elements should be quite worrisome to the international community, because the dynamics in Bolivia have been playing out in a very violent, racist, anti-indigenous dynamic that has been unseen in Bolivia, I would say, since the 1953 agrarian reform, but certainly has become more acute since Morales's ouster. In Cochabamba, we also have something that didn't exist before, another parastate group, the Cochabamba Youth Resistance. It's a masked motorcycle gang with clubs. They have been seen to coordinate freely and openly with the Bolivian police force. They have tear gas currently. They have bulletproof vests. During the period of the time of the change of government, people's addresses were sent out electronically on social media. They have targeted indigenous women, the pollera, broken up road blockades, threatened indigenous groups, and threatened MAS. This group yesterday formally and publicly supported Carlos Mesa. We have to ask, and it's something that's, I think there are a lot of parallels with the balanced, open-minded candidate openly accepts the public support of a far-right abusive parastate group. And I wish I had brought the logos, for example, of the Cochabamba Youth League waving the flags and their Black Eagle logo, which to me is very, very similar to the symbolism that you saw in the Third Reich. So we have, as the US has, a far right that has adopted a very racist, discriminatory discourse. We have key candidates that have not denounced this discourse, that have also provided racist attacks against MAS, attacking MAS as hordes, attacking MAS as troglodytes, attacking specifically the Chapare coca growers as MAS, as narco guerrilla, as drug trafficker, a very toxic discourse that has become normalized in Bolivia, and that the international community has done very little to speak out about. There is no discourse in these elections about what will be done with these parastate groups. Will there be judicial consequences? The leader of this Cochabamba Youth League is facing prosecution, but you don't have candidates on the right speaking out about violent parastate action. There have to be proposals for law enforcement, for key roles, and for a reestablishment of rule of law here. Because what we have seen, and there were definitely flaws in the Morales administration, but during this Áñez interim period, a complete deterioration of the rule of law. a total disregard for due process and judicial norms, political charges through the public prosecutor's office that are unfounded, repeated, and abusive. This is something, for example, that Human Rights Watch has pointed out in its report, Harvard University, and AIN and WOLA in our work with cells. So what is the way that we move forward with candidacy, either a Mas win or an alliance between the candidates on the right, Mesa, who proposes that he is more centrist, but in an alliance with Luis Fernando Camacho on the far right, in an alliance with Samuel Doria Medina, who was Áñez's vice president, and an alliance or a very public support with Arturo Murillo, the current very repressive Minister of the Interior. So, you know, we have to look at a potential return to brokered democracy and the deals that have been made that would form a coalition that could potentially defeat Mas. And I think that we have to look very clearly in terms of moving forward at addressing impunity for gross human rights violations, and in what context will that be done? I think that a future Mesa government or a future coalition government has stated very clearly that they have a great deal of interest in renewed US funding. And I think it's important to point out, as we've pointed out in the past, that that funding to the security forces is restricted by the Leahy Amendment. And there have been, as Eduardo pointed out, no transparent investigations of the killings or the gross human rights violations. The military and the police have not participated, nor have they identified the units involved. And this is an impediment for funding and something that has been implemented very successfully in Bolivia in the past. So I think that all sides need to be able to look at and propose a way forward, but that engages with and that addresses these key fundamental problems. But right now we don't see that in the debate, and we don't see on the part of the international community support for these key issues. Another issue is the establishment of the experts group from the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, something that the Áñez government agreed to do in December of last year, but that has consistently impeded and blocked. These kinds of lack of attention or respect for international institutions are something that should be a red flag for the international community and the US in the coming months. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Catherine. I think Catherine's points really underscored the challenges for any incoming Bolivian government, given the fractures in society, and as Catherine referred to, the toxic rhetoric that's become normalized, and I think moves elections from a question of alternation in power to an existential threat. My opponent is not just my political opponent, is my adversary and my enemy, and potentially wants to annihilate me. And when the stakes are that high, the concern is that people are willing to do ends justify the means, and take steps that violate all of the precepts of democracy and rule of law that we've been talking about. So I think this explains the urgency and the concern about this moment, and the need for ever stronger and more focused international attention, as well as, I would emphasize, and then I'll hand to Santiago, the forbearance, even if it seems unlikely, the restraint on the part of Bolivia's political leaders going into these moments. To date, that's not been the case. There's been an amping up of the rhetoric that's exclusionary and that's demonizing. I think in the context of such a fraud electoral process, that's to be expected probably. But when the outcome is in doubt and it's close and there are already charges of fraud, it becomes extremely dangerous in such a volatile situation. I think Santiago is going to walk us through some of those points right now, and then we'll open more to your Q&A. And please do consider sending questions in the Q&A box toward the bottom right of your screen. With that, Santiago.
Thank you. Can you all hear me now? Wonderful. So it's great to be here. Great to be here and share some of my impressions with you all. And I want to thank WOLA and especially John for the invitation. Thank you also to the interpreters that are doing a great job. I'm honored to be here in this panel with former President Rodriguez Belcé and with Kathy Ledevere. And it's hard to make good remarks after these two wonderful presentations. I was invited to actually reflect on the roots of the current crisis, to take a little bit of a step back and speculate also a little bit about the potential scenarios after these very peculiar elections under in Bolivia's democratic period. And I will proceed in that order. So let me start first off by placing Bolivia in broad regional context. Morales' presidency was a prominent example of the left turn in Latin America, a turn that was unprecedented in its scope and its duration, producing 32 presidential victories by left-of-center leaders in 11 different countries between 1998 and 2015. But Bolivia's left turn differed in important ways. The MAS in Bolivia had stronger and deeper roots in social movements than its regional counterparts, and it proved much more effective at bringing leaders from those movements into positions of power. And in doing so, it enabled a profound circulation of political elites that deeply transformed Bolivia's political development. Bolivia's left turn wasn't singular in its ending, however. As a project of deepening democracy, it found enormous limitations, or it reached a dead end in the past 5 years or so. And in so doing, as my fellow panelists already mentioned, it allowed conservative forces with questionable democratic vocations to reclaim their customary hold on the reins of state power. Bolivia's once widely celebrated process of change culminated in extreme forms of political polarization, upheaval, and huge deals of uncertainty that brought us together today. An uncertainty that I do not see, at least in the short run, as conducive to routine and institutionalized alternations of power, in which all major social and political actors can compete for office and wield power effectively. So I will provide a little bit of the context, background, and then how future scenarios are probably likely scenarios. And starting from Morales's fall last year, which really laid bare the country's deep social and political divisions, which the tense impasse over the elections only aggravated and made much worse. His fall also produced a lot of binary thinking. Some of my colleagues already alluded to that, but of binary interpretations. And although I'll only mention them in passing, I will try to stay away as much as possible in my remarks. There's a lot of circular and perhaps reductionist thinking, as Eduardo mentioned, that I don't think is terribly revealing. And it reflects in some ways the sharp degrees of polarization in the country, and also the partisan nature of academic discussion. And here I'm talking about the fraud versus not fraud, and the coup versus popular insurrection type of debates. So we know a few things and we have doubts about other things. So we may never know what actually happened in October last year. Morales may have well won the disputed election with sufficient votes to win outright in the first round, and several studies point in that direction. What we do know for sure is the allegations of fraud had become more plausible due to the lack of confidence in the independence of the electoral authorities and because of Evo's refusal to accept the results of the 2016 referendum. This suggested that he was bent on remaining in power despite legal obstacles. In addition, we know that the role of the OAS was counterproductive at best. And I think it may well be so in the upcoming elections. It is also clear that by 2019, the MAS had lost the overwhelming majoritarian electoral support that his government had been able to reproduce for about 14 years. And we finally know that Morales' removal from office happened as a result of a combination of factors, as a result of civil society protests, sustained civil society protests, a police rebellion, and also pressures from the military. This was hardly a process that adhered to constitutional procedures. And I know that people do not like this term a lot, but in my view, it looked like a coup and it was a coup. And I agree with Eduardo that this can be reductionist, but I will try to elaborate my point in a minute or so. So to understand where we are now and where we might be headed toward, we need to move past those debates and review the achievements, limitations, and legacies of Bolivia's left turn. And I will be very brief so I can privilege some time to discuss the scenarios moving forward. So I will not attempt to and will not try to explain the sequence of events in the past year, but I will focus on the broad lessons learned from Bolivia and the prospects for democratic politics. And this is the big picture as I understand it, at least. Several things went right with Evo Morales in power. Bolivia performed well economically. Morales and the MAS directed and managed an economy and the improbable accomplishment of registering South America's highest average growth rate for a sustained period of time. Granted, there were very serious problems, and especially since 2014, when the country began to experience an economic slowdown. But at least comparatively, Bolivia performed strongly, and especially well in the longer arc of Bolivian history. This is particularly remarkable also when compared with the economic performance of other left-turn governments of the region with which Evo Morales is often compared. I'm talking about Venezuela, for example. Social inclusion expanded dramatically, and we can see this in the remarkable reduction of inequality, which experienced the steepest drop in the region, and this is truly remarkable. There's some truth to the claims and the success story as told by the MAS. There were important limitations too, but the large picture is fairly accurate. The limitations were in the realm of creating formal sector jobs, and the inability of the MAS to pass a tax reform that enabled the government to sustain the gains. And I could say Eduardo pointed us in the right direction on the limitations of the MAS. Bolivia entered the current multi-level crisis today with fragile healthcare system, fragile education systems, despite making huge social investments in these areas. Political inclusion expanded dramatically. Voter turnout increased notably in Bolivia since 2005 when Morales was elected, and socioeconomic status and ethnicity became less important, gradually less important in determining turnout. The representation of previously underrepresented groups in legislative bodies and in state agencies increased to historical levels, allowing a wide range of subordinate groups a greater voice in national politics. I could say that democracy deepened along this participatory dimension. Surveys before the crisis of last year show that as of 2018, satisfaction with democracy remained comparatively high. I'm talking about comparatively in the region. And it declined after 2016, the referendum, but not dramatically. And very interestingly, as of 2018, Bolivia had one of the lowest percentages of the population agreeing their country was governed for the benefit of the powerful. So there were large segments of the population perceiving that government policies made a real difference. But of course, this success story had lots of limitations. Morales' autocratic proclivities put all of these gains in jeopardy. These proclivities led to several authoritarian distortions and abuses of power, some of which were mentioned by Eduardo, which translated electorally into the gradual loss of support among the middle classes and among the youth in particular. Over time, these temptations to concentrate power and repeated violations of liberal democratic norms proved to be Morales' Achilles heels. And unsurprisingly, they sharply polarized politics by creating a binary political divide that actually helped to unite opposition, an opposition that for a long time was too fractious to pose a serious electoral threat to Morales. So I agree with Eduardo about the nature of polarization. I could trace it even a little bit, before in time. Autocratic temptations by Morales also ignited regional opposition movements, for example, in Santa Cruz and Potosí, that mobilized against Morales in the lead up to the election. And these temptations also very crucially weakened Morales' own social basis. The result was that by 2019, in October last year, movement allies, the backbone of support for the mass, were weakened, or you can even say unwilling to defend their government. It bears noting, though, that mobilizations in defense of the policies or the inclusionary gains after Morales was removed from office were indeed pretty strong, which tells us that, despite one may think about Morales, inclusion in Bolivia, the inclusion that I mentioned before, was real, and any attempt to roll back those gains will likely continue to produce prolonged conflict and violence. In short order, Bolivia became increasingly polarized as Bolivia's left turn ran its course, concluding in institutional fluidity and political gridlock, and also the development of a difficult, if not an impossible, political game. Bolivia's field, as has been noted by my fellow panelists, is now sharply divided into two major antagonistic camps, Masistas and anti-Masistas, and neither can govern effectively while excluding the other. And yet, neither claims a willingness to cooperate with the other, which is a dangerous kind of political game. Under Morales, the anti-Masista camp splintered in at least two groups with clearly distinctive class and regional bases of support and distinctive leaderships, but with the shared goal, the unifying goal of preventing the return of the mass, sometimes at whatever cost. This camp agrees on some programmatic issues, like the need to boost the private sector, the need to privilege or strengthen agribusiness as an economic engine for the economic growth, and the need to reverse, they agree also on the need to reverse the role that popular movements play in national politics, the very same groups that were empowered by the mass. In this polarized environment, the threats to democracy are many. And here I worry about the short-term violence, as particularly as right-wing elements that Kathy mentioned may not be willing to accept a fully democratic order that includes the mass as equal partners. And I also fear that mass supporters may not accept an adverse result. I also worry about the medium term, or the possibility of even having peaceful politics in the context of deepening polarization. Just a few concluding remarks here, and I'm not sure how I'm doing with time, but I'm gonna go as quickly as I can. I agree with Kathy completely that the Áñez's de facto government has done a lot of damage. She not only engaged in violent repression, but also attempted to roll back the previous gains in terms of inclusion. She also attempted to undermine the MAS, which is still the country's most popular and better organized political party, and she attempted to do that by fracturing and demobilizing its social base. Her commitment to prevent a return to the mass, a return of the mass by any means, reflected a raw animosity that was latent in broad segments of Bolivia since Morales first came to power, despite the seeming calm and stability that marked portions of his presidency. Áñez's government ended up severely weakened by the pandemic, however, and ended up losing support in great deals of legitimacy, which will be hard to rebuild. There's tons of evidence that the conditions for free and fair elections have been compromised. Kathy already talked about that, very clear, so I will not expand on that. The empowerment of the military and the police is, to me, especially worrying. Now, talking a little bit about the polls, there has been a dance of polls recently, and I will not get into the details of those, but it looks as though we will have a really tight, kind of heart attack inducing context like last year. And I'm not going to predict anything or to predict any outcome. It would be unwise. But Arce is leading the polls, and 4 out of 5 of the polls reveal that he may not be able to prevent a runoff. It is unclear at this moment whether the polls, the existing polls, capture the rural votes well enough, and whether foreign votes will play a decisive role or not. The quick note about fraud and electoral observation, that I know it's a question that has already come up in the Q&A. As I said at the beginning, we may never know whether the mass committed electoral fraud, as Mesa claims and others, of course, but there's still also many open questions about the interim government's commitment to a free and fair election. For one, I want to emphasize this point: the toleration of these parastatal groups that Kathy just mentioned is blatant, and it's, you know, and really there's little discussion about this. But while there are many remaining mysteries about the fraud itself of last year, one thing has become crystal clear to me, at least, it's that the role of the OAS was really counterproductive. We have learned not only of serious errors in their analysis, but their determination to lash out at critics rather than own its own mistakes. The OAS responses to criticisms, perhaps even more than their mistakes, which are, you know, they happen. But the response have led independent organizations to call for the OAS to take a step back in the electoral observation, but those calls have been unheeded. Whoever wins in Bolivia this Sunday, or in the second round, will definitely encounter a new and completely new and very challenging context. For one thing, it looks as though whoever wins the presidency, as Eduardo told us, whoever wins will not take it all and will likely have to deal with a divided Congress. Also with highly mobilized and sharply polarized society and a deepening economic and public health crisis. Governing Bolivia, Eduardo knows this very well, is hard as a general rule, but it will be especially hard with a contracting economy and very little capacity to redistribute. Rebuilding trust in that context will be hard. Whoever comes to power will also encounter a weak and hollowed out state, a mobilized society, and deepening social inequalities. And what we know from social science work and empirics is that weak states tend to generate high public discontent and ineffective and slow responses to economic and public health crisis will likely erode public support quickly. There aren't clear mechanisms to manage this deepening polarization, as Eduardo said, and also the stakes of power are very high and continuously raised by major political actors. Presidentialism only aggravates this issue of the high stakes of power. There are few signs that strategic actors might lean towards moderation in office. Almost all of them have threatened opposition actors with political marginalization, if not de facto exclusion. And this only raises the stakes even higher. So I fear little patience for whoever comes to power, as we see region-wide. And that, of course, with a weakened economy and a little capacity for spending, can have devastating consequences. Can I have 2 more minutes, John? All right, so if successful in a runoff, Mesa, for example, will arrive to power and have a weak, ineffective state and also a sluggish economy, plus intensified societal opposition. This, I fear, may not end well, but I'm very pessimistic today, sorry. He will have difficulty building a majority, and political alliances needed to pass legislation. Eduardo's comments kind of pointed us in that direction too. It is not clear how willing he will be to reach out to the MAS, which is still the best organized party in the country, and how easy it would be for him to reach out to Camacho, Bolivia's new right-wing contender, who's building his own kind of political project and electoral force in Santa Cruz. And Mesa's past experience as Bolivia's president, and also his lack of investment, his notion of how to do politics without relying on organizational support of any kind, also shows that he's not particularly savvy at navigating troubled, complicated waters. Sorry, I needed to say it. So on the other hand, Arce only governed the economy or only governed, quote unquote, when the economy didn't experience major trouble. He was an architect and the manager of the successful economic model, but the mass also governed for the most part with crushing legislative majorities, and if not, with broad levels of societal support, and in a much friendlier international environment too. So I would hope that in an eventual victory, Arce would be willing to reach out to the moderates on the other side, but moderates, again, are hard to come by these days. So this is a problem of what happens when one continuously raises the stakes and organizes an electoral campaign with a central premise to prevent the return of Bolivia's number one enemy back to power. So this is what happens when you turn, as John said before, political conflict into existential conflict. And here, kind of lots of parties are guilty of the same sin. Kathy made a really, really good point, and I will conclude with that one, but it is unclear what the role of the military and the police will have in politics. I agree 100% with Kathy. It's not clear what each candidate has to say, what they have in mind about reimagining the relationships with security forces, but opening the doors to them as an arbiter last year and pouring tons of resources in the past few months, and even praising them for the role in bringing about the triumph of democracy, or the forcing Morales' exit. That set a terrible precedent with potentially lasting legacies for democratic politics. Deepening polarization and government ineffectiveness may only empower these actors even further, and I fear that this may have bad negative side effects. On that, I will conclude my remarks, and I'll welcome your comments and questions. Thank you all.
Super. Thank you so much, Santiago. And now we will go to Q&A and some conversation across our speakers as well, because they made some points that referred to one another's analysis. I'm going to pose the first question, and then we're going to dip into our question box as well. And this is really for everybody, because it's come up in a number of ways. I think one of the sort of signal accomplishments and contributions that was achieved during this interim period, and Eduardo mentioned it at the outset, was a reconstituted Tribunal Supremo Electoral. In other words, an electoral authority cognizant that the credibility of the previous authority had eroded dramatically and gave credence to, at the very least, the idea that the election could be stolen and that fraud could take place. I think that's a hugely important question. As the major candidates are talking about fraud today, what have you seen in terms of the capacity of the current electoral authority to maintain in public view the sense that it is credible, that it will deliver clean and legitimate elections? And attached to that question, which is clearly important given what happened last year, beyond what's in the control of the TSC itself as the national body, but also the regional electoral tribunals, what other mechanisms might parties and partisans determined to win at all costs, what steps might they take to try to suppress or repress the vote of the people they see as not just opposition, but as actually enemies? So that's a first question. And then let's pair that with one of the first questions that we received, which was, how would you, and this was specifically for Eduardo, how would you evaluate the role of the OAS? Santiago talked about it just now, not just in terms of their role last October, but in terms of their first sort of blessing of Evo Morales's bid for re-election in the first place. So taking it back a little bit, they've had a longer term, played a longer term part in this episode. So those are the first two questions, and then we'll come back with more. Eduardo, you may want to begin.
Thank you, John. I will speak in English now. The fraud idea is very important these days, but just like last year's comments, every citizen has a right to be in the vote counting at the end of the journey. And people take pictures with their cell phones of every single acta. that is sent to the center of polling. So in my view, if people keep taking pictures and sort of participating with their presence in the counting of the votes, they'll do the best part in terms of avoiding fraud. What happened last year was that this early results scheme didn't work. But otherwise, the Bolivian electoral system, I would say it works well. And the current Tribunal Supremo Electoral can do much better than the one we had last year. So I'm not that worried about fraud this time, because people probably will do better than last year, and they will not go out in the streets and claim with violence. Probably we learn a very hard lesson from last year. Turning into the OAS and international community that has come up in several questions, I would say that the OAS Council as a political space depends on who runs the representation of each country. In other words, it's a swinging opinion body. The OAS Council probably has had many positions over different countries in different times. And I would say that the OAS recently, in the last few years, has been very polarized, precisely with what Santiago was saying. We have, as in Bolivia, we have the MAS and anti-MAS. At the OAS, you have the left pro Maduro, Morales, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and the rest of them. It's a very polarized council. So my worry is that it is not the OAS itself, its council, because they are just political opinions, which again are swinging according to the times. What worries me is the Inter-American system of human rights, the council and the court, that's going through a severe crisis, and those are the ones that we should be worried about. If we enhance the commission and we enhance the court, so we have speedy opinions regarding issues like re-elections or human rights violations, we'll do much better in the region than worrying about what the Council of American States have to say. And also I have to say that that council has different attitudes regarding what happens in countries like in Bolivia, like the Secretary General was in Bolivia going along with Evo even to the Chapare region, and he was not saying anything about his re-election, and now he turns into an anti-Evo character. But that's not the issue. The issue is let's focus on what we Bolivians can do about fraud and how transparent are our elections. We shouldn't be worried that much about what the OAS or the European Union or anyone else comments about Bolivian elections. I think the challenge for Bolivians is to be at the place, vote, and make sure that our vote counts, not what the OAS says. I think that's one of the lessons that we have to learn. And obviously that has to do with how we manage our foreign policy, which in the Janine Áñez government it's been very worrisome, because the very same date that she took power, she decided to take a position in foreign policy, endorsing governments like Donald Trump's in many ways, and decided without having any legitimacy or horizon about what Bolivian foreign policy is. She decided to do many things that should be taken into account by a long-term government, but she didn't. So there are many things that are a concern of Bolivians rather than the international community.
Great. Thank you, Eduardo. Now, before we turn to Santiago and Catherine, and then we'll come back to you, Eduardo, as well, let me add a couple of questions that are related to the questions posed, which is, first, do you have confidence that if Arce does win the presidency outright in the first round, as polls have suggested he might, that the government and electoral authorities would accurately report and acknowledge that result? or do you think the government would attempt to steal the vote for Arce's opponents by falsifying the results in order to send the vote to a second round? Two related questions. What role will Evo Morales be playing during the elections? And has Mas gained autonomy from his political leadership? What will Evo do if and when Arce wins? What about when someone else wins? So those are some related questions. So let's go to Catherine and Santiago, and then we'll come back for more questions.
Do you want to start, Kathy? If not, I'm happy to get us started.
Please go first. Thank you.
Oh,
Santiago, you can go first.
Thank you. Very quickly, and first of all, to link it to the previous question on the degree of the institutional capacity of electoral authorities, I think I agree completely with Eduardo. This is probably the institution in Bolivia that enjoys some degree of legitimacy and trust. And it's impressive how it's been rebuilt in a very tight, difficult setting. I'm not worried about fraud. I'm worried about the claims that people make about fraud. And I think it's a dangerous precedent with, unpredictable consequences, as we learned last year. Mesa was announcing this, that a monumental fraud was in the making. And I thought those claims were dangerous back then. I think they're dangerous now, whoever makes them. And I've heard Murillo coming to talk to Almagro, and then they posted a nice picture of them talking about the possibilities of fraud. I think it's a dangerous kind of rhetoric to introduce in a contest that will be tight. But I do think that the TSA has done important steps towards electoral transparency. And there's a new TREP system, as I understand it, that it's named differently than TREP, and it will release results differently than last year. So they attempted to build new degrees of confidence in the counting, and I'm not worried about the real possibility of fraud, but I am worried about the claims of fraud and what that may generate in the event of not really contested numbers. What will Evo do? And I will address that one. And it's one that I had in my notes and didn't get the chance to talk. But the MAS has shown a remarkable resilience and ability to recover impressively, I would say, from a major political defeat against all sorts of expectations. People expected the MAS to collapse immediately and to fracture. And even in the selection of a new presidential candidate, that the internal tensions would be so high that it would fracture, become many different things, etc. And yet the party found ways to reorganize its structures and remain a strong contender in the midst of state violence against leaders and supporters, as Kathy told us, and also going through a period of leadership renovation. What will Evo do? I cannot tell, right? It will be a hard one to predict. But the way I see it is Morales is gradually, or he seems to be gradually displaced as the ultimate decision maker within the party. It remains to be seen what role he will play, but yesterday's message, in my view, was fairly optimistic. Of course, we have heard Evo say, this time around, I'm gonna retire, go to the Chapare and fish forever. And he didn't do it in the past, but my sense is, seeing what's going on internally in the MAS, that he's gradually becoming not a marginal actor, but one with symbolic kind of power, but not so much effective decision-making authority.
Great. Let's hand it to Kath for answering this round, and then keeping time. We'll have a little more than 10 minutes. I'll return to all the panelists with the last series of questions that are going to be focused on the United States policy in particular and the international community. So, Kath?
I agree that I also share concerns about Almagro's very biased statements, the stance on the photos he chooses to post. What I see is a partial attitude and a rejection of MAS. Will that come through in electoral monitoring? We don't know. His framing is certainly problematic. The other thing that's really important about this vote is that because of the COVID pandemic, there's a number of international observers, their level of activity, how they will function has been severely limited. I don't perceive that there will be problems with the actual count, but I do worry about the very firm statements from ANYA's officials that MAS will not take power, by security forces opposing MAS taking power, which really suggests a rejection of a MAS win. You know, one of the things is how the results are actually counted and reported. And I will remind everyone that much like in the US, the vote count takes a long time. The rural vote takes a longer time to arrive. The rural vote will tend to favor MAS for obvious reasons. But what is done with those results, and are they accepted by the losing party? That's an issue that I think we really have to counter with, as well as voter suppression and harassment, perhaps during the voting period or an uproar afterwards. I think Evo Morales, if Evo Morales has made a public statement that he will not be directly engaged if Arce wins. I think that the temptation to engage will be very difficult for Morales. He certainly engages through his Twitter account, but that Santiago's point that MAS is much larger than Morales, it's always been a coalition of different social grassroots groups, different interests, and often those interests are contradictory. So to simplify MAS to Morales, or to believe that Morales had the sole decision-making capacity, that was not accurate. If the right is to win, I assume that Morales will continue in exile, or it really depends very much on these terrorism charges that have been placed against him, which have no legal backing. But I think that this strategic maintenance of Morales out of the country also will be counterproductive for a government if MAS doesn't win, because it continues to create a stance where some sectors view Morales as martyred or a hero. I don't think it strategically works well in order to strengthen a position of another government, and that's something they need to take into account.
Thank you, Kath. So with the remaining time, we're going to take on a few more questions that go more to the international role, the role of the international community and U.S. policy in particular. So obviously the U.S. is in the midst of an election campaign as well. And it could be, the polls suggest here, that Joe Biden will emerge as president. What implications might that have for U.S. policy toward Bolivia, depending on who wins the Bolivian elections? The U.S., even under the Obama administration, was never particularly friendly with the MAS in power. Another question has to do with what role the U.S. Congress might constructively play, including now in the days leading up to the elections in Bolivia, given the complexities. And then the role of the Bolivian diaspora within the United States, perhaps concerned about, the future of their country, but also with a firm, foot and life within the United States, what role they might play in terms of safeguarding the future of the democracy in their home country. And then finally, the international community is sort of has come up a lot in terms of what it might do. With the view to the elections upcoming, not just electoral observation, human rights issues have also been mentioned. What role should the international community look to play going forward in Bolivia, regardless of who wins the elections and who takes power, given the complicated path for governance ahead? So let's go, let's keep with Kath, and then we'll go back to Santiago, and then we'll conclude with Eduardo. Thank you.
Well, I think there's strategically been an issue of channels of communication between the MAS government and the US government and the international community in terms of several key topics. And I think what we've seen is, an opposition to MAS that is more fluent in English, many living in the United States, many with an ability to engage consistently and an interest in consistently engaging with US policymakers and members of Congress in framing a discourse, and really have very successfully in the past framed a discourse that I think diminished Morales's shortcomings and exaggerated Mas's or they enhanced Mas's shortcomings and they diminished Mas's achievements. And so this discourse and this accessibility, I mean, it's something that certainly diplomats are very susceptible to. Who pays more attention to them? Who is it easy to get a meeting with? Whereas with Morales, you maybe had to schlep to the palace at 5 a.m. in the morning. So these difficulties in communication and a management of the discourse by the opposition, made what was already a US reticence to accept Morales, made that breach even greater. I think it's fascinating to see that, and you mentioned the Obama presidency, the Morales administration fully expected to engage with Obama. They saw that administration as open for change, as something for new, as more progressive. They saw President Obama as an African-American, more open to the difficulties of social movements and indigenous people in Bolivia. And that was a door that was not taken advantage of by the Obama administration. And it has to do with a lot of who engages with US political operators across the board. And it's pretty interesting to note that Arce and Morales are quite different. Arce speaks English. Arce has gone to events in the United States. His discourse is noticeably tamer. And I think that there needs to be an opening to the US and a reevaluation of some of the there were certainly attacks on the part of Mas against the US, but there were also a lot of actions on the part of the US that impeded a discourse or a greater understanding. And, really problematic in this procedure, although there's been an outcry from US members of Congress, and very many of them, that there hasn't been, in terms of the Trump administration, recognition of the inherent problems, the human rights violations. The US report on human rights practices did not cover that. They left it out. In terms of drug control, which has always been a key issue, they really praised Agnes without any evidence supporting her actions. And so it really is a time, and I don't expect this if Trump wins, but a time for the Biden administration to step back and take a broader view and reevaluate positions and engagement. Because what we've seen is that these politicians, anti-Morales politicians, had a very diplomatic discourse during Morales's government to engage US policymakers. And at the point of the time where the coup occurred, it became a very racist, extremist, almost authoritarian, Trump-esque discourse. And I think that needs to be a red flag for people in the US and the international community.
Great, thanks, Kath. So we'll go to Santiago and then Eduardo. And both of you, please use this as sort of a chance to make your sort of final comments as well, as we're getting near time, and beg the indulgence of our interpreters as well. So Santiago?
Yeah, I will keep it absolutely very, very, very short, because I think the best persons to respond this set of questions related to international community are indeed Kathy and Eduardo, more than me. Their expertise is far greater. The only thing that I could add to Kathy's point is the real need to engage in discussions, not just with foreign governments, but with foreign creditors, which I think this would be the issue to flag moving forward. The state of the Bolivian economy today is not particularly great, and this would be one area that I'm concerned with. But I don't have a solution or an answer to that question. Only to say that I know that Arce is very savvy at navigating in those types of worlds, and that there's some kind of regional support for some of his proposals, particularly from Argentina. difficult relationship with Brazil. That would be another issue that we didn't get the chance to talk, but I would like to flag it as something to think about. Again, he will, and whoever, an Arce presidency will encounter a very hostile, if you will, regional environment. As my concluding remark, probably just to thank you all for your attention, and I would be happy to engage with whoever wants to send questions my way. I know that there's many more in the Q&A, but there's no time. So thank you all.
Great. Thanks, Santiago. And Eduardo?
Thank you, John. Just a couple of issues before getting into the U.S.-Bolivia relationship. One is regarding the worries that Santiago and Kathy mentioned about fraud and the government respecting the results. I would strongly think that the Bolivian people will be mature enough to go by the results and not by any temptation of any kind from anybody. Furthermore, if the current government has a narrative that it is a government because it has to oust the mass, I think that they're wrong and they should think about it. And it's the people's vote that counts, not anything else. The other thing before concluding is the issue of corruption that's been around the campaign, and it's in the papers all over. I would think that the idea of sweeping under the rug allegations of fraud or corruption regarding candidates has been around for a long time, even in the electoral process last year. I think Bolivians need to make a more transparent process, and candidates should be open to show what they've done and what they haven't done. So people should be aware of what kind of candidates have. And I think integrity is something that we're lacking, and oversight mechanisms, fair and independent institutions, specifically judicial ones, are lacking. But getting into the last point, having been a diplomat for the last 6 years in Europe provides me a challenging answer. I would say that it's not an issue only of Bolivia and the US, it's an issue of a world that struggles into keeping multilateralism active. And this position of the US that's been challenging in multilateralism, specifically the UN, a number of UN agencies like the World Health Organization, or its attacks to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, or you name it. And Bolivia is in the middle of a number of small countries that have to deal with these superpowers that tend to manage the world. I've seen that while being a diplomat elsewhere. And to my understanding, it's a key issue for whoever comes into power in Bolivia. I would strongly recommend that we take a policy of good neighbors or good neighborliness, rather than being aligned to the US pro-Trump or whoever is in power in the US or China or Russia. We should be non-aligned and sovereign and take good advantage of being good neighbors to the rest of the world. But that's what our leaders should be thinking about. Thank you, and thank you, WOLA, and everyone for being with us today.
Super. Thank you, Eduardo. And for putting this on an even broader plane, I think, in terms of multilateralism and the challenges, but also the possibilities for Bolivia's next government. And just to conclude, I think this has been a good time and a good space for the kind of reflection we've been able to have. And as Eduardo just indicated, it should be the case that the Bolivian people are going to have the final word on this question with their votes on Sunday. Not final in the sense of forever, but final in the sense of who will be their next legitimate authority. And that is a profound moment for any country, and I think all the more so for a country like Bolivia that's gone through the turmoil of not just the past year, but the polarization of the past several. And in that sense, I think this reflection has, helped us look beyond the immediate concerns about the election and the challenges that any new government will face, but also it strikes me that no matter who wins and no matter who loses in this upcoming vote needs to recognize that there's a sizable piece of the country, a sizable number of their fellow Bolivians who are on a different side politically, and that trying to annihilate them and trying to govern without them is a recipe for further polarization and calamity, I think, for Bolivia. And to proceed in a way that understands that Bolivia is, in fact, plurinacional politically, and has different tendencies, but that doesn't mean that annihilation of the opponent is the way forward. In fact, finding a way to coexist, as difficult as it may be, is the best way forward. And I think true leadership will emerge in that crucible. A true leader is not the one who is going to look to ostracize and annihilate the opposition, but find ways to work with them. Undoubtedly, that's going to be enormously difficult, even if the election goes super smoothly on Sunday. So with that sort of editorial note, I do want to thank all of our participants, our audience who's been engaged and asked questions, and especially thank our speakers, Eduardo, Catherine, and Santiago, for spending their time with us, and be assured that we'll be paying as close attention as we can to the upcoming vote and what comes next. So again, thanks to our participants, thanks to all of our speakers, and to our interpreters as well, and everybody at WOLA behind the scenes who helped make this and events like this possible. So thanks once again, and everybody stay safe and enjoy your day.